No one inside the glass lobby of Crestline Water Systems paid much attention to the man, standing near the service entrance that Tuesday morning. He wore a canvas jacket that had been washed too many times to hold its original color, carried a folder tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve, and waited with the kind of stillness that people mistake for emptiness. His name was Grant Whitmore. He was 47 years old. He had driven 40 minutes across the city to apply for a facilities maintenance position on the overnight shift, and he had rehearsed every possible version of this moment on the ride over. He had not expected to feel calm, but he did, or something close to it. The woman behind the reception desk was named Brenda Chu, and she looked at Grant's application the way people look at something that doesn't quite belong in the pile it arrived in. She noticed the 9-year gap in his employment history first. Then she noticed the word engineer listed under previous occupation, and she looked up at him with a flat, appraising expression. "You were an engineer," she said, not a question, more like a fact she found amusing. Grant told her he had maintenance experience, understood water treatment systems at a structural level, and was available for all overnight shifts. Brenda leaned back in her chair and said, loud enough for the 2 other applicants seated nearby to hear, that it must be something. A man who used to design systems now applying to clean the floors underneath them. One of the other applicants smirked. Grant looked at neither of them. He watched instead a small stress fracture running along the corner of the lobby's exterior window. The kind that spreads slowly when nobody catches it early enough. He said nothing about the window. He set his folder on the desk and waited. What Grant did not know, could not have known, was that when his application reached the document processing system upstairs, a flag attached itself automatically to his full name, Grant Allen Whitmore. The flag had been dormant for 9 years. It activated now the same way an old alarm activates when the door it was set to watch finally opens again. On the 14th floor, inside an office that still smelled faintly of cedar from the previous occupant's furniture, Natalie Forsyth was reviewing acquisition proposals when her assistant placed a printed alert on the corner of her desk. She almost didn't look at it. She had learned in the 7 months since taking over as chief executive of Crestline Water Systems that most interruptions could wait. This one could not. She recognized the name before she fully understood why. Grant Allen Whitmore. The flag beside it read, Restricted Personnel File. Executive Review Required. Natalie set down her pen. She thought of the gray metal box her father had left inside his desk drawer, alongside a handwritten note sealed in an envelope addressed to her. She had found it the day after the funeral when she was cataloging his personal effects, and she had sat with it in her hands for a long time before opening it. Inside the envelope had been 3 things: a short letter in her father's handwriting, a worn engineering access badge bearing a name she hadn't recognized at the time, and a second note, separate from the first, that said simply, if this man ever comes back to this company, read the letter before you speak to anyone else, especially Lawrence. That second note had troubled her for 7 months. She had tried twice to locate records connected to Grant Whitmore's name and found that the relevant files had been systematically removed from the company's archive. Not lost, not misfiled, but removed, which was a different thing entirely. She asked her assistant which position the man had applied for. Overnight facilities maintenance. Natalie stood from her chair, crossed to the window, and looked down at the city below. Then she called the reception desk directly and told Brenda Chu in a quiet and entirely unambiguous voice that Grant Whitmore was not to be dismissed or redirected until further notice. What she did not notice was the figure standing in the hallway behind her reflection in the glass. Lawrence Pemberton had been Crestline's chief operating officer for 11 years. He was 61, silver-haired, and had survived every leadership transition the company had ever undergone by making himself essential and invisible in equal measure. He had seen the flag before Natalie had, because he had maintained a private monitoring alert on that name since the day the original incident was closed. He stepped back into the corridor and sent a text message before Natalie's call to the lobby had finished. When two security officers appeared beside Grant in the lobby, Brenda Chu announced loudly that his file had been flagged at the executive level and that he would need to surrender his visitor pass and leave the premises. The other applicants looked at him the way people look at someone who has just been caught at something. Grant handed over the pass without argument and asked, in a voice that carried no edge at all, whether this constituted the company's official response to his application. Natalie's assistant arrived 30 seconds later and told the room that the chief executive had requested Grant Whitmore be brought to the 14th floor immediately. The silence that followed took a moment to settle. Brenda Chu stopped mid-sentence. The security officer stepped back. The applicant, who had been smirking a moment before now, sat very still. In the elevator, the assistant asked Grant if he had ever been inside this building before. Grant looked at the floor numbers climbing and said that the building had been smaller when he used to work here. The assistant did not ask a follow-up question. Grant studied the hallway as it came into view through the elevator doors. He recognized the general layout even beneath the new materials. He noted where the primary filtration monitoring terminals had been relocated, where the server access points now sat, and where a secondary pressure gauge station had been removed entirely from a wall it had occupied for over 2 decades. He cataloged these things quietly, the way a person catalogs the rooms of a house they once lived in and were made to leave behind. Lawrence Pemberton was already in Natalie's office when the elevator opened. He told her, pleasantly and without apparent urgency, that Grant Whitmore was a former contractor with a documented history of negligence. A man whose errors had sickened 43 people and cost the company its operating license for 7 months. He described the situation as settled, legally and administratively, and suggested that whatever sentimental impulse her father might have left behind in a letter was not a substitute for the institutional record. Natalie listened. Then she asked Lawrence why a man dismissed from the company 9 years ago was still worth worrying about today. Lawrence said he was only protecting the company's interests. Grant entered the office in his worn jacket, carrying nothing. He and Natalie looked at each other for a moment across the length of the conference table, and what she noticed was that he did not look defeated. He looked tired, the way a person looks after carrying something heavy over a very long distance, not broken, just accustomed to the weight. Lawrence spoke first, telling Grant that he had hoped they would never be in the same room again. Grant said he hadn't come for Lawrence. He had come to apply for a job. Natalie placed her father's letter on the table. Edward Forsyth had written it 2 weeks before he died, in the shaking handwriting of a man who understood he was running out of time to correct things. He confessed that the contamination event of 9 years earlier had not been caused by Grant Whitmore's negligence. Grant had been the one who discovered that a set of filtration membrane assemblies, purchased through a vendor Lawrence had personally selected, were failing at a rate that made a contamination event inevitable. Grant had flagged the problem internally 3 weeks before the incident. His report had been buried. When the contamination happened anyway, Lawrence had used Grant's earlier access to the affected systems to construct a narrative in which Grant's unauthorized modifications were to blame. Edward wrote that he had known Lawrence was lying within the first month. He had not corrected the record because the company's legal exposure at that moment was severe enough to bankrupt it, and Lawrence had argued that one man's reputation was a manageable sacrifice. Edward wrote that he had been wrong to believe that. Near the bottom of the page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, Lawrence is not only protecting the past, he is still using the same vendor. The contracts are still running. Natalie looked up from the letter. Lawrence's expression had not changed, but something behind it had shifted, a tightening, barely visible, like a structure that has just registered the first stress it was not designed to absorb. Grant looked at the letter without reaching for it. He told Natalie that he had not come to relitigate the past. He had come because the overnight maintenance position would let him be home during the day when his daughter needed him. He said it without apology and without asking for sympathy. Natalie asked why he had never fought the official record through the courts or the press. Grant said that a man without institutional backing, who challenges a company with 11 years of legal preparation, rarely wins that fight publicly, and that the only thing he had ever truly needed to protect was his daughter's ability to grow up without watching her father lose in front of everyone who mattered to her. Lawrence chose that moment to remind the room that sentiment was not admissible in place of documentation. Natalie told Lawrence the meeting was over and asked him to leave. He did, but not before remarking to Grant that some people never learn when they've already lost. Grant said nothing. He was watching a data display on the wall behind Lawrence's shoulder, a live feed from the facility's pressure monitoring system. And something in the numbers was wrong in a way that felt familiar and deliberate. Natalie hired him on a 30-day probationary basis, assigned to overnight maintenance under Rosa Mendez, who managed the facility's crew, and had held the position for 19 years without ever once having her work acknowledged by anyone above the third floor. Rosa Mendez noticed Grant on his first shift. Not because of anything he said very little, but because of what he did. He checked equipment no one had asked him to check. He documented pressure irregularities with the precision of someone who understood exactly what the numbers meant. He memorized the facility's layout faster than any new hire she had trained before. She said nothing to him about what she observed. She simply kept a private log of his notes. Each night before his shift began, Grant called his daughter Maeve. She was 10 years old and believed her father worked nights, fixing things that broke in big buildings. He had built that explanation carefully, using only enough truth to make it hold. He told her he was helping people notice problems before they got worse. She asked once if that was interesting work. He told her that it depended on what you were looking for. She accepted this the way children accept answers they sense are larger than they appear. Those calls were the fixed point of his nights. Whatever happened in the hours on either side of them, and some of what happened was not small, he carried into each call like a man setting a heavy bag down briefly before picking it up again. It was enough. It had been enough for 9 years. During his second week, Grant discovered that 3 chemical dosing units in the secondary treatment corridor were running at settings 20% below the regulatory minimum. The variance was small enough to avoid triggering automated alerts, but large enough to matter. He reported it through the proper maintenance channel and was told by the overnight supervisor that the settings had been adjusted by a certified contractor and that a probationary employee should not be submitting technical findings outside his assigned scope. Rosa quietly pulled the contractor's certification records the following morning and found that the VER's license had lapsed 14 months earlier. She kept that document alongside Grant's original report and said nothing to him yet. Lawrence Pemberton had been watching the situation more carefully than anyone knew. When he learned that Rosa was accessing contractor files, he contacted Patricia Lund in the HR compliance office and told her there had been a report of a probationary maintenance employee accessing systems outside his authorized clearance level. Patricia processed the complaint without verifying it. She came to the facility with 2 security officers and a written termination notice. Grant was in the secondary treatment corridor when Patricia arrived and announced to everyone within earshot that his credentials had flagged an unauthorized entry into the building's chemical management system. Several members of the overnight crew turned to look at him. He stood with a mop handle in one hand and said nothing. He asked quietly whether the access log she was referencing had a timestamp. Patricia said the log showed access at 2:14 in the morning. Grant said he had been in the main corridor replacing a drain cover at 2:14, and that the corridor camera would have him on footage for the full duration of that hour. Rosa Mendez walked in before Patricia could respond, carrying the shift assignment record and a printed copy of the camera log. She set both on the nearest surface and said that Grant Whitmore had been exactly where his schedule said he was at the time listed in the complaint, and that anyone who wanted to verify it could do so in approximately 4 minutes. Patricia looked toward the corridor door. Lawrence Pemberton had appeared there sometime in the last 30 seconds. He nodded once. Grant asked evenly how Lawrence had arrived at the facility this quickly, if the complaint had only just been filed. Lawrence said that a man in his position monitored situations that affected the company's operational safety. Grant said he understood. His tone made clear that he understood rather more than Lawrence intended. The matter moved to a formal hearing. Natalie ordered the board assembled, and Lawrence spent the days before it working the members he had cultivated over 11 years, framing the situation as a rogue chief executive using a disgruntled former contractor to manufacture a case against the company's most loyal executive. The hearing convened on a Thursday morning. Grant arrived directly from his overnight shift. He sat at the far end of the conference table in his work clothes, a fact Lawrence used immediately, telling the assembled board that the contrast between the two men in the room was itself the clearest evidence of who had earned the right to speak with authority. 2 board members nodded. Grant asked to see the incident report from 9 years ago. Lawrence presented it with the ease of a man who had been preparing for this request for 9 years. Grant studied the document for 40 seconds. Then he pointed out that the digital formatting signature embedded in the header was not consistent with the company's documentation system as it existed at the time of the incident. The metadata, if anyone pulled it, would show the document had been generated using a software version released 18 months after the date printed on its cover page. Lawrence said he was speculating without technical access. Grant said he was reading what was in front of him. Natalie had quietly retained an independent systems auditor named Colin Draper, who had spent the previous 2 weeks reviewing Crestline's vendor contracts and maintenance invoices. Colin stepped forward and presented his findings. A recurring set of contracts awarded over 6 years to a filtration equipment supplier called Marsh Culver Industrial, which shared a registered business address with a private holdings company connected to a trust in Lawrence Pemberton's wife's name. The invoices showed premium pricing for components that the serial numbers traced back to refurbished stock. Over 6 years, the overcharges totaled slightly more than $4 million. More critically, several of the compromised filtration units were installed in sections of the facility that handled municipal water delivery to 3 residential districts. Lawrence turned to the board and said that a man who had failed this company once and returned in disguise to pick at its past was not a credible witness to anything. Grant asked the board whether they would like to understand how the current system was failing right now, in real time, before the next monitoring report gave the state a reason to ask the same question. He pulled up the pressure feed data on the room's main display and walked through each deviation, each suppressed alert, and each equipment signature that corresponded to a Marsh Culver component installed within the last 3 years. He used plain language. He did not rush. He answered every technical question the board asked without consulting notes. A junior board member asked him how he could recall this level of operational detail from a facility he hadn't officially worked in for 9 years. Grant said that a man does not forget the systems he spent 4 years building, or the morning he realized someone was about to let them poison people's water and decided to stop it anyway. That answer landed differently than the contract figures had. Because it was not an argument. It was simply true. Lawrence called for an emergency vote to remove Natalie from her position before the audit could be formally entered into the record. He believed he had the votes. What he had not accounted for was Rosa Mendez, who arrived at the boardroom door carrying a storage box she had found 3 days earlier in a locked equipment closet on the facility's lower level, behind shelving units that had not been moved in over a decade. Inside were the original internal reports from the contamination event, including Grant's flagged warning from the week before the incident and a signed acknowledgement form showing Lawrence Pemberton had received it, read it, and marked it as non-priority. The acknowledgement had Lawrence's initials at the bottom, written by hand 9 years ago. The vote did not proceed. Lawrence Pemberton was escorted out by the company's internal compliance team in the quiet, efficient way that follows the moment when a room full of people simultaneously understand how they have been managed. As he passed Grant, he said that none of this would change what Grant had lost over the years he had spent in maintenance corridors. Grant told him that was probably right, and that the corridors were exactly where the real work had always gotten done. Patricia Lund was placed on administrative leave. The board accepted a full independent audit of vendor contracts going back 8 years. Natalie offered Grant a position that had not previously existed, Director of Systems Integrity, with a mandate to establish independent review processes for every treatment facility the company operated. She told him the salary was what the position deserved, not what someone might think he should accept given where he had been. Grant did not accept immediately. He asked first that Rosa Mendez be appointed to a newly created role overseeing worker advocacy and facilities labor standards, with a seat at the table on any operational decision affecting the overnight and maintenance crews. Rosa, who had spent 19 years moving invisibly through the building and had never once been invited above the 4th floor, was told by Natalie personally. She sat very still for a moment and then said she had some things she had been wanting to say for a while. Natalie told her she would have the floor. Grant took the position. He finished his last overnight shift before the new role began the same way he had finished every shift before it. Checking the equipment one more time, noting the things that needed attention, leaving the floor in better shape than he had found it. Natalie found him in the secondary corridor at 5 in the morning, wiping down a control panel no one had asked him to clean. She asked why he was still doing it. He said that a system doesn't know whether the person maintaining it has a title. It only knows whether someone is paying attention. She stood there for a moment. Then she picked up a shop rag from the supply cart and helped him finish the panel. It was a small thing, but it was the first sign that what she wanted to change about the company was not just the people at the top of it. Several months later, on an afternoon in early spring, Maeve Whitmore sat in the front row of a modest ceremony held in Crestline's Employee Recognition Hall. She was 10 years old and had worn her good shoes and spent the morning asking her grandmother how she should act when people she didn't know started talking about her father. Her grandmother had told her to just listen. Grant stood at a small podium, not in a boardroom, not in front of attorneys and executives, but in front of the facilities crew, the overnight maintenance workers, and the technicians whose names had never appeared in any company announcement or annual report. Rosa Mendez sat in the front row beside Maeve. He kept his remarks short. He said he had learned more about the true condition of a system by working alongside the people who maintained it at 3 in the morning than from any document that had ever crossed a conference table. He thanked Rosa by name. He thanked 6 other members of the maintenance crew by name. He asked that their names appear in the official program rather than his photograph on the cover. When he stepped down from the podium, Maeve was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not pride exactly, Something quieter than that. The look of a child who has just been given a piece of information that reorganizes everything she thought she already understood. She didn't ask him any questions on the way home. She sat in the passenger seat watching the road, and eventually said that she hadn't known fixing things was like that. He asked her what she meant. She thought about it for a moment and said she had always imagined it was just about the broken parts. She hadn't known it was also about making sure the right people got to be seen. Grant kept his eyes on the road and said nothing for a while. He thought about the 9 years he had spent quietly carrying what had been done to him. Not out of weakness, but because he had calculated correctly that fighting in the open would cost Maeve more than it would cost Lawrence Pemberton. He thought about Rosa, who had built her integrity out of 19 years of being overlooked and had offered it freely when it mattered most. He thought about Natalie Forsyth, who had opened a dead man's letter and chosen to believe it even when believing it was inconvenient. And he understood that the truth had not waited for him. He had simply been patient enough to still be standing when it finally arrived.